his country back home in French. We'll take a little break here and talk about what we've heard so far. Interesting, Richard, I don't know if a lot of people know this. The president calls this the USMCA. In Canada, this deal is called the CUMCA. So a little diplomatic push and pull there with Prime Minister Trudeau putting Canada first. The president, obviously, part of the reason he wanted to rename this was to put the United States first in it.
Put the United States first. He had to rename it because he was so critical of NAFTA. What's also ironic about this is much of the content did not simply come out of the solar system. Much of the content of all places came out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, if people recall, in the first week of his presidency, Donald Trump took the United States out of it. This is the Asia-Pacific trade agreement. And after criticizing that, a big part of the content of the USMCA was essentially cut and pasted from that. So just saying, which is not a bad thing, just an ironic thing.
There is, Susan, the notion of passing this through the Congress first.
Right.
So the president can sign it here, but as he referenced a moment ago, he's got to get this through the Congress. One hopeful note, Chuck Schumer, the Democrat, of course, from New York, said, quote, "The president deserves praise for improving upon NAFTA." So he likes what he sees effectively in this new deal. You think it passes through the Senate and through Congress?
It should, but I think in discussing it with Richard, it will be tinkered around with a bit. There's going to be some changes that have to be made, and I think that's where we'll see a little bit of contention, especially on the House side.
And if there's changes made to the text, the problem then is you reopen it and you've got to go renegotiate it.
With the new president of Mexico.
Right.
Who doesn't want it. One of the reasons this is happening today is the new president of Mexico, who also, shall we say, has issues with trade, wanted this done on the previous guy's watch. So he would not have to bear responsibility for any controversial aspects of the agreement inside Mexico. So if Congress decides it has to change the text, that creates real problems for this thing surviving. What you might see then is pressure in Congress not to amend it per se, but to have side understandings. And that's traditionally what's happened in the history of U.S. trade agreements. You don't reopen the text. You have 5 or 10 unilateral understandings or side deals, ways of helping American workers who may have lost their jobs because of foreign competition. So my prediction is you'll see an awful lot of that. Essentially, the marketplace will be open, particularly in the new House of Representatives, which the Democrats will control.
I want to go back to what Schumer said. It's interesting. Complimenting the president, I would be hard-pressed in the 8 years in the Obama administration to hear Mitch McConnell or anybody say one positive thing about any Obama accomplishment.
Yeah, but it was out of self-interest that Chuck Schumer said this. Let's not forget the Democrats really are having some problems in the middle of the country, dealing with trade. So it makes sense that he would show that there was support for it, especially when he did it prior to the midterm elections, to show that they weren't completely turning their back on their constituents.
So, Richard, how do you, going forward for this administration, use this as a template for other trade deals, for other deals that they want to rip up? I mean, they got out of TPP. There are the talks with the South Koreans to do a bilateral trade agreement. Does this become a template of sorts for this administration?
Yeah, we've got the South Korean deal, so-called course. The next big trade deal is going to be Japan. And what I think you'll see is elements of this and elements, again, of the discredited TPP are going to inform the basics of the U.S.-Japanese agreement. So I think over the next 2 years, putting aside China, which is not a trade deal so much as a negotiation to deal with all of our problems, I think the next big free trade agreement will be the United States-Japan, first largest economy in the world, third largest economy in the world. So that will be big. And I think this will provide a lot of the content for that.
Katty Kay is the president of Mexico now gets in, and we listen. Prime Minister Trudeau is going back and forth between French and English, so we'll keep a close ear on it and bring it to you. But the President of the United States has said not long ago at the White House of this new deal, USMCA, quote, "It's the single greatest agreement ever signed." That's the President of the United States talking about this deal, not to overstate.
Yeah, we're used by now, right, after 2 years of President Trump talking in superlatives. It doesn't actually always mean that those superlatives are real. And as Richard was saying, 90% of this deal, according to most economists, is pretty much the same as NAFTA. The single biggest change is the name. That was very important to President Trump. It is interesting that the incoming president of Mexico, AMLO, who is a populist, who campaigned to some extent on protecting Mexico Mexico from American aggression, as he sees it, has effectively signed on to this deal. He effectively agreed to it, which is how Peña Nieto could get it through. He doesn't want to be there at the signing ceremony. But this is some tribute to the Trump administration that they've managed to work with two very different Mexican governments. Peña Nieto more conservative, AMLO more left-wing and more populist, and that they have put so much effort into this. And Jared Kushner has been credited with laying a lot of the groundwork for the signing ceremony that's taking place right now, assuming that this all gets through Congress.
So, Gene Robinson, as we've been listening into the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, as he touted this new deal, the USMCA, he also said, but it's important that we remove tariffs in steel between our two countries. So if you see President Trump looking a little steely-eyed straight ahead, it's because of that.
Yeah, right. President Trump is, he loves his tariffs, doesn't he? I mean, he loves his tariffs because they're resulting in the opening of, what, 6, 10, 12 new steel plants? Oh, hold it. That's actually not happening. He keeps claiming that it's happening, but it's actually not happening. Who knows where this is going to go? I really see this ceremony. It is important. These are our neighbors and our huge trading partners, but I know that what the financial markets are really waiting for, and a lot of people are waiting for, is how does the encounter with President Xi of China go? And that's sort of the big news that I think Wall Street and London and Frankfurt and the other big financial markets are waiting for out of this whole summit.
Yeah, Gene's right on that. What's interesting, and the reason Trudeau, among other things, hates those steel and aluminum tariffs is why we used the national security provision of American law, basically, which was put into place against companies. We didn't want to become dependent on adversaries to provide us with critical items like steel and aluminum. But the last I checked, Canada is an ally, and Canadians, among other things, are alongside American troops and are dying in places like Afghanistan. So for Canada, it's hard to exaggerate what an insult it is that we are using national security justifications for introducing tariffs against them on steel and aluminum. It really sticks in Trudeau's
Prime Minister Trudeau has said that out loud, too. So now we're being treated like an enemy. Your neighbor to the north, we're being treated like an enemy. So, Richard, as we listen in on this, the president may take some questions. When the president of Mexico is finished, we'll certainly dip into that. But for people just waking up, our viewers this morning, what should they be thinking about with the G20? Obviously, the news about Michael Cohen's latest plea deal and with the special counsel's office is front and center. It's the backdrop, actually, to this entire day for President Trump, as he may run into Vladimir Putin. He may run into the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. What are you going to be looking for here?
Those are two things. How does he handle those two, shall we say, diplomatically awkward encounters with the Crown Prince, who is trying to make things look normal, despite the fact they're anything but, with Mr. Putin, who's once again committing outright aggression in Ukraine, and how we deal with that. I actually think, though, the markets and a lot of foreign policy types, people in my world, would be looking mainly at the meeting between President Trump and Xi Jinping, the president of China. And they can't solve the U.S.-China trade disagreements. There's too many moving parts. The question is, can they calm it down? Can they have something of a temporary truce, maybe so the United States would not introduce the next promised or threatened layer of tariffs from 10 to 25%? Can China's lead trade negotiator be invited to Washington in the hopes they could work something out? That, to me, is the real question. Or does that not happen, and do we very quickly move to the next phase of confrontation with China? My hunch is that will ultimately be the lead story out of the G20.
That may be the most important, despite all the other headlines. Yes, we're also joined this morning by Pulitzer Prize-winning author and presidential historian, the great Doris Kearns Goodwin. Doris, good morning. So glad to have you join our conversation. You've watched a few of these presidential summits over the years. What are your impressions about what we may see over the next couple of days?
Well, what we're already seeing, I think, is that whatever may be accomplished at this summit is shadowed by the Russian dealings, which has shadowed President Trump's entire campaign and presidency. I just think about the fact that Adlai Stevenson said the challenge is not how to win a race, but how to win without proving you're unworthy of winning. And all the deals that were made, the fact that the business dealings for President Trump were top and center when he was running for president. Think of it, it's the highest office in the land. You're about to possibly occupy a position that was held by George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or FDR. And at the top of your mind is whether or not you can make a deal with Russia. And if nothing's wrong with that, as he says, this is perfectly allowable to me, then why have so many people lied about it? Why has it been covering up? It's become the story of his presidency. So even at this moment, when something interesting may happen, and hopefully it will at this G20, that cannot but be in the background, even in the foreground.
Doris, it's Katty Kay here in Washington. To what extent do you think that projects forwards? We know that it hasn't been the norm up until now for presidents to say, look, it's very cool for me to have pursued these business interests, even if potentially, I guess, they may have been in conflict with U.S. national security interests. Has President Trump changed the nature now of running for the highest public office, that this will, going forward, be seen as something that is acceptable, legitimate?
Yeah, I hope not. I mean, I think the norms that we're seeing that are unprecedented, we feel a sense of being unmoored in normal norms. And the hope is that the difficulties it's presented, and he has understood, he has to understand the difficulties it's presented from. It's constantly what's asked of him. You know, perhaps it's why he doesn't want to meet with Putin today. Perhaps it was why he didn't want to go to the cemetery in Europe. Perhaps it's why he didn't go on Veterans Day, because things were happening that unmoored him. And hopefully the lines that will be drawn about what's acceptable and not acceptable will be constraints. They're already constraints, but they should be on constraints on our former presidents. We have to hope we learn from this episode. Time is what's been so valuably lost. You think about the time a president has. Think about the time any of us have. And I get older, that matters even more. And for time to have to be spent rebutting these things, talking about people in your administration who are lying, undoing institutions who you think are doing harm to you. I mean, we should be concentrating on the problems of the country. So hopefully this is not creating a norm for future presidents, but rather a constraint and a warning that they will follow.
Doris, this is Gene Robinson. Have we ever had a president whose personal and corporate financial dealings we've had to be so curious about and concerned about or not? I mean, has there ever been any, not a direct precedent, but anything like this that you can remember?
You know, I really can't. I mean, surely there have been presidents who've had business interests, whether it was Jimmy Carter and his peanut industry or President Bush originally involved in the baseball thing. But it seemed like once you get into that possibility of running for office or becoming president itself, that's not at the top of your list. You're aware that this is such an honor that's been given to you, to the American people, that you put that down. But for President Trump, it seems it's always been intermixed. The deal is still at the top of his agenda, and he's never really made that separation between campaigning and governing, between business dealings and governing dealings. So I don't see that. Maybe somebody will find something back in Millard Fillmore's life that I don't know, but not that I know.
And there you have it.
I just love saying his name. There's something about Millard Fillmore's name that gets to me.
Doris, we've got Millard Fillmore and Adlai Stevenson. It's not even 8 o'clock in the morning yet.
Meacham's jealous.
Yes, you're making John Meacham jealous, as Richard Haas points out. What you're seeing right here is the presidential Sharpie has come out. The President of the United States is now signing the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, dubbed by President Trump the USMCA. We point out again that it still does have to be ratified by Congress. The president is optimistic that will happen, but he's still got some work to do that. Sitting alongside the Prime Minister of Canada, let's listen in as the president speaks here for just a moment.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to the team. Thank you very much.
We thought there may be an opportunity there for some questions from the gathered press there, but the president quickly making his way off the stage after signing the USMCA. Richard, what jumps out to you as you watch that?
Well, it's an important accomplishment. And you know, after all the storm and drang about NAFTA, how it became almost the poster child of what's wrong with trade, essentially we now have an agreement that kind of walks like a duck and talks like a duck and quacks like a duck, and it's you know, it's slightly different, but it's 80 to 90% what NAFTA was. But the good news, it was preserved, and but I think it was preserved, by the way, because of the importance of Canada and Mexico to the U.S. economy. The fact that a lot of Americans, businessmen and farmers who had an enormous stake in this relationship, began to weigh in. So the difference is here. The president moved against the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the first week of his presidency, took the United States out of it before there was any opposition that had gelled. Because of that, people got involved to preserve NAFTA, and what essentially happened is was preserved. Again, the name was changed to make it politically swallowable for the administration. But again, the good news is we avoided what would have been a major problem for the U.S. economy, which at least now, again, I think it does open the way to a U.S.-Japan agreement. The big question again, though, will be Saturday night, dinner with Xi Jinping. Can they not solve the problem? Can they at least park it and diffuse it for the time being?
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.